I never thought boredom could lead to something so disturbing. It was a typical night, scrolling through forums and random sites to pass the time. Then I remembered a link a friend sent me, calling it the strangest thing on the internet. I clicked it out of curiosity, a decision I'd regret more than anything else in my life. At first it seemed harmless, even philosophical. People discussing boundaries, freedom, and the human condition. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted. Their words weren't just ideas, they were instructions, commands. And before I realized it, I wasn't just observing anymore. I was part of something I couldn't escape, something far darker than I was ready to face. It started as a harmless distraction, a way to pass the time late at night when sleep wouldn't come. But the forum I stumbled upon was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't just about sharing ideas or debating philosophies. It was darker, insidious. People weren't just talking, they were acting. And the more I read, the more I realized how easily they blurred the lines between discussion and action. What disturbed me most wasn't just them. It was how quickly they pulled me in. It was one of those nights where time stretches unnaturally. The kind where you're stuck between exhaustion and restlessness, lying in bed with the cold glow of your laptop screen as your only companion. I was working late shifts at the time, my sleep schedule a mess, and my brain too fried to do anything productive. Scrolling through the internet had become a ritual, aimless, mind-numbing, a way to pass the hours until sleep finally won. That night started like any other. Reddit, YouTube, maybe a little Twitter, the usual carousel of meaningless content. But then I remembered a link a friend had sent me earlier that week. It had come through Discord with a cryptic message, "Check this out when you've got time. It's a wild ride." The URL didn't look familiar. One of those weird, obscure domains that scream old internet. At first I didn't bother. It seemed like one of his typical edgy recommendations. But sitting there, staring at the same Reddit threads I'd read a dozen times before, I gave in. The site loaded slowly, like it hadn't been updated in years. The homepage was minimalist. No graphics, no ads, just text. The title across the top read, "Exploring the Edges of the Human Experience." Below it was a series of categories, each one more unsettling than the last. Liberation through pain, unmasking the self, the final freedom. It was bizarre. At first glance, I thought it was some kind of fringe philosophy forum, the kind where people debate Nietzsche or post vague existential quotes to feel profound. But the phrasing was off. Something about it made me pause. Curiosity won out, though, and I clicked into one of the categories. The threads were long and rambling, filled with posts from people claiming to have broken free from society's constraints. Some shared personal stories, long meandering accounts of how they'd let go of shame, fear, and even physical attachment. Others wrote in almost religious terms, like they'd found salvation in rejecting everything that tethered them to the world. It was unsettling, but nothing I hadn't seen in other corners of the internet. Extreme, sure, but still within the realm of weird. What really caught my attention was how active the forum was. The posts weren't just from years ago, they were recent, minutes, sometimes seconds apart. There was a live chat feature embedded in the sidebar, and it was constantly moving, filled with cryptic messages I couldn't fully understand. Ready for step 3. Did you hear about what happened to Redacted? DM me when you're ready to commit. The more I read, the less it felt like a discussion and more like indoctrination. The users weren't just theorizing, they were actively encouraging each other to take steps towards something that felt deliberately vague, but undeniably ominous. And the deeper I went, the more I realized they weren't just talking about abstract ideas. They were doing things, extreme things. One thread stood out to me. The title was simple, "How to Let Go Completely." It had over 100 replies, and the original post was pinned at the top. I clicked on it, half expecting some kind of pseudo-philosophical nonsense. But what I found made my stomach tighten. The post was short, just a few paragraphs, but it was written with a kind of intensity that felt personal. The author described their journey toward freedom in poetic terms, almost like a confession. They spoke about how they'd shed their fears, abandoned their attachments, and embraced what they called the ultimate truth. They never explained what that truth was, but the way they described it felt like a challenge. The last line stayed with me. The first step is to stop asking why and start asking how. Message me if you're ready. For reasons I can't fully explain, I clicked on their profile. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I wanted to convince myself this was all some elaborate performance. Their account was active, dozens of posts, all with the same cryptic tone. Some were detailed instructions on how to break free. Others were messages of encouragement to users who seemed hesitant, like they were recruiting people. And then there were the replies. I shouldn't have read them. They were wrong. Disturbing in a way that I can't fully articulate. People describing things they'd done, things they claimed were necessary steps on the path to freedom. They used euphemisms, vague language, but the implications were clear. And the worst part? They weren't just talking about themselves, they were helping others do it too. I scrolled through post after post, each one worse than the last. It wasn't just the content that unnerved me, it was how they spoke to each other. There was a sense of community, almost camaraderie. These weren't isolated individuals shouting into the void. They were connected, organized. They had rules, rituals, shared goals. And the more I read, the more I felt like I wasn't just an observer. I was being pulled in. That's when I saw it, my username. In the live chat sidebar, someone had mentioned me. New user in thread title. Let's see if they're ready. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't commented on anything, hadn't interacted with the site in any way. How did they even know I was there? I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a bot or some kind of automated system. But then another message appeared. Welcome, my username. We've been waiting for you. I closed the browser immediately, my hands shaking as I slammed the laptop shut. But even as I sat there in the dark, staring at the blank screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the messages or the posts, it was the way they made me feel. Like they'd seen something in me I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just some weird corner of the internet. It was something else. And I wasn't sure I could walk away. I told myself I wouldn't go back. After closing the browser, I even deleted the link from my Discord messages, blocking the friend who'd sent it, as if that would somehow sever the connection. I tried to convince myself that it was just a prank, some elaborate ARG designed to freak out curious onlookers. But even as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just the forum itself. It was the way it made me feel. I'd been in strange corners of the internet before, but this was different. It was like the words on the screen were reaching for something inside me, something I didn't want to admit was there. And the fact that they'd addressed me directly, that was harder to shake. The next day, I went about my routine, trying to pretend nothing had happened. Work was uneventful, the usual drudgery of emails and meetings. But the entire time, it felt like a shadow was following me. Every notification on my phone made me jump. Every unfamiliar face on the street made my stomach twist. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But that night, when I sat down at my laptop again, I couldn't resist. I reopened the browser and typed the URL manually. The site loaded instantly this time, no hesitation. It was like it had been waiting for me. The forum was just as I'd left it, threads upon threads of unsettling content, the live chat buzzing with activity. But now, something was different. When I scrolled to the bottom of the page, I noticed a new thread pinned to the top of one of the categories. It was titled, "Welcome New Seeker." My heart sank. Against every ounce of better judgment, I clicked on it. The post was directed at me. It didn't use my name or username, but the language was unmistakable. The author talked about how everyone reaches a breaking point and how they'd been watching me long before I joined the forum. They wrote about patterns, habits, the little cracks in a person's facade that reveal who they really are. The worst part, they were right. Every word felt like it was written specifically for me. I closed the post and opened the live chat, half expecting to see more messages directed at me. But this time, it was quiet. The users were still there, posting their cryptic messages and replies, but none of it seemed to acknowledge me. For a brief moment, I thought maybe it had all been a coincidence. Maybe I wasn't as special or as targeted as I thought. Then a direct message popped up. "Are you ready to see the truth?" It was from the same user who'd written the post. Their profile picture was a simple black circle, their username just a string of random characters. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to close the browser and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had brought me here in the first place, couldn't resist. "What truth?" I typed back. The reply came instantly. "The truth about yourself. We already see it. Now it's your turn." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It felt like they were daring me to go further, to prove something to myself. Before I could respond, another message appeared. "Join us tonight, 10 p.m. room 7. Room 7. I clicked on their profile, hoping for some kind of explanation, but it was blank. No posts, no information. Just the cryptic messages they'd sent me. When I checked the time, it was 9:46 p.m. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe I wanted to prove that it was all fake, that these people were just playing some elaborate game. Or maybe part of me wanted it to be real. Either way, when the clock hit 10, I refreshed the page. A new section had appeared on the site. It was called The Room. There was only one thread inside, titled Step 1, Observation. I clicked on it. The thread was empty except for a single embedded video. No text, no comments, just the video. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. It started innocuously. A dark room with a single light overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. The camera was stationary, positioned at an angle that suggested someone had left it running and walked away. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a figure stepped into the frame. They were wearing a mask, plain, featureless, like something you'd buy at a costume shop. Their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as they placed objects on a table in front of them. A notebook, a knife, a small mirror. They didn't speak, but the silence was deafening. Every sound, the scrape of the knife against the table, the creak of the chair as they sat, felt amplified. The figure opened the notebook and began to write. The camera didn't zoom in, but I could just make out the words, names, dates, what looked like fragments of sentences. It felt intimate, invasive, like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see. Then they turned the notebook toward the camera. Written in bold letters across the page was a single sentence. "We see you." My stomach dropped. I slammed my laptop shut, my breathing ragged. But even as I sat there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was just a trick, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were right. They did see me, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel unseen again. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words written in that notebook, "We see you." It wasn't just paranoia. It was a sense of exposure so raw and overwhelming that it made my skin crawl. The idea that someone, some group, had been watching me, studying me, wasn't just frightening. It was humiliating. like they'd seen something in me I didn't even know was there. The next day, I told myself I was done with the forum. I even uninstalled my browser, thinking that would somehow sever the connection, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. At first, I thought I could ignore it. I went to work, avoided my laptop, and tried to act like everything was normal. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, I jumped. Every time I saw someone glance at me on the street, my stomach tightened. By the time I got home that evening, I was a wreck. That's when I noticed the envelope. It was sitting on my kitchen counter, a plain white envelope with no return address. My first thought was that it must have been left by a delivery driver, except I hadn't ordered anything. I picked it up cautiously, my hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. Written on it, in the same bold, blocky handwriting from the notebook in the video, was another message. Step 2, participation. My chest tightened. How did they know where I lived? I dropped the paper like it was burning me, backing away from the counter. This wasn't just some online rabbit hole anymore. They'd found me. They were here. For hours, I paced around my apartment trying to decide what to do. Calling the police felt pointless. What would I even tell them? That a forum I'd visited online had somehow tracked me down and sent me a cryptic message. They'd laughed me out of the station, but doing nothing felt worse. It felt like surrender. As the hours dragged on, I started to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone I knew had seen me on the site and decided to mess with me. The idea was comforting, but it didn't explain how they'd gotten into my apartment. By the time the sun went down, I was too exhausted to think clearly. That's when my phone buzzed. The notification was from an unknown number. The message was short. Check your computer. My heart sank. Against every ounce of better judgment, I powered on my laptop. The browser opened automatically, and the forum loaded before I even had a chance to navigate away. A new thread was pinned at the top of the page. It was titled, "For You." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trackpad, but deep down I knew I was going to click it. I couldn't stop myself. The thread contained another video. This one was different from the last. It wasn't some cryptic ritual in a dark room. It was footage of me. The video started in my living room, the camera shaky as it panned across my couch, my coffee table, the pile of laundry I'd left on the floor. It was my apartment, unmistakably. The camera moved toward the hallway, pausing outside my bedroom door. Then slowly, it pushed inside. There I was, lying on my bed, sound asleep. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. This wasn't possible. How had they gotten inside? How had I not woken up? My thoughts were racing, spiraling into panic. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. It was like my phone wasn't even capable of making the call. A new notification popped up on the screen. "Don't run." I dropped the phone, my breathing shallow and erratic. They were in control of my devices, my apartment, maybe even me. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't safe anywhere. Another buzz, another message, the door. I froze. My eyes darted to the front door, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every creak and groan of the building feel like a threat. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. No footsteps, no voices, just a small package sitting on the welcome mat. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a piece of twine. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to pick it up. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. Inside was a phone, not mine, a different phone, an older model with a cracked screen. It buzzed as soon as I touched it, a new message appearing on the lock screen. Step 3, obedience. My stomach churned. I wanted to throw the phone away, to smash it into pieces, but something stopped me. I unlocked the screen, and a new message appeared immediately. "Turn around!" I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Slowly, I turned to look over my shoulder. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Another buzz. "Run!" I didn't hesitate this time. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the apartment, away from the forum, away from whatever was happening to me. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching. By the time I finally stopped, I was in an unfamiliar part of town. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across the pavement. My phone buzzed again. Not the old one, the new one. "You can't escape yourself." I stared at the screen, my breath hitching. They were right. This wasn't just about the forum or the messages or the videos. It was about me, about the choices I'd made, the things I'd ignored, the parts of myself I didn't want to face. They'd seen it all, and now they were forcing me to confront it. The phone buzzed one last time. A single word appeared on the screen: submit. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the screen. Eventually I sat down on the curb, the cold seeping through my clothes. I felt hollow, like they'd stripped away every part of me that mattered. And maybe that was the point. I don't know how long I stared out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The city below seemed unchanged. Cars moved along the streets, distant laughter echoed from a bar, and a faint breeze rustled the leaves of a tree I could barely see in the darkness. Everything looked so normal. It almost convinced me that I was still part of that world. But I wasn't. Not anymore. I turned away from the window, the cracked phone still clutched in my hand. The screen had gone dark, but the last message lingered in my mind. Let go. What did they mean? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every possible interpretation felt wrong, yet disturbingly inevitable. The words weren't just a suggestion, they were a command. And worse, part of me wanted to obey. The laptop on the table caught my eye. The screen had dimmed but remained on, waiting for me to engage again. I hesitated, my body frozen between the impulse to investigate and the overwhelming dread of what I might find. The air in the apartment felt heavier, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on me. I sat down, opening the laptop with trembling hands. The document I'd written earlier was still there, the words staring back at me like an indictment. Page after page of my thoughts, raw, unfiltered, deeply personal. I scrolled through them, reading the things I'd typed in a feverish blur. Regrets, doubts, things I'd never admitted to myself, let alone anyone else. They weren't just watching me. They were pulling me apart, piece by piece. The phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. It wasn't a command or a cryptic phrase. It was a question. Do you feel it yet? Feel what? The fear, the guilt, the crushing realization that I'd lost control of my own life? I wanted to respond, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to type anything. Instead, I stared at the phone, waiting for the next message. It came almost immediately. "We're close!" The words sent a chill down my spine. Close to what? Close to me. Close to whatever endgame they'd been building towards since the moment I stumbled onto that godforsaken forum. The thought was unbearable. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room like a trapped animal. I needed to do something, anything, to break free from this. But no matter how hard I tried to think, I couldn't come up with a plan. Calling the police felt futile. I had no evidence, no proof that any of this was real. Even if they believed me, what could they do? These people weren't just hiding behind screens. They were here, in my life, in my mind. The phone buzzed again, And this time the sound made me jump. I snatched it off the table, my hands trembling as I read the message. "Open the door!" My heart stopped. I turned toward the front door, half expecting to see it swing open on its own. But it remained closed, the deadbolt securely in place. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed, before taking a cautious step forward. The hallway outside was silent. No footsteps, no voices, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. Another buzz, another message. "It's time." I backed away from the door, my chest tightening. Time for what? I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself from thinking about it. My mind replayed everything that had happened over the past 2 days, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no logic, no reason, only a growing sense of inevitability. That's when I noticed the noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. A low hum, steady and rhythmic, like the buzz of electricity or the distant rumble of machinery. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the apartment with an almost imperceptible vibration. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, pressing against my thoughts, invading my senses. I covered my ears, desperate to block it out, but it was inside me now, pulsing through my skull like a heartbeat. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't look at it. I couldn't. My vision was swimming, my legs unsteady as I stumbled toward the couch. The hum was unbearable now, a relentless drone that drowned out everything else. I collapsed onto the cushions, clutching my head as the room spun around me. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there for a moment, disoriented, before realizing the phone was still in my hand. I looked down at the screen, my stomach twisting as I read the message. "We're here." My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the apartment, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The laptop screen flickered, drawing my attention. A new document had opened, the cursor blinking at the top of the page. Slowly, words began to appear, typed out one letter at a time, as though by an invisible hand. "You've been chosen." Chosen for what? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no sound came out. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. The words on the screen continued to appear, each one cutting deeper into my already fractured psyche. "It's not about them, it's about you." Tears streamed down my face as I read the words. They were right. This wasn't just about some shadowy group on the internet. It was about me, my choices, my actions, my willingness to follow them down this dark, twisted path. They hadn't forced me into anything. I'd done it all on my own. The screen went blank, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then a final message appeared, written in bold, unrelenting text. "Let go. You know what to do." I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the screen. The words were simple, but their meaning was anything but. Let go of what? My fear? My resistance? Or something more permanent? The phone buzzed one last time. When I looked at the screen, there was no text, just a countdown, 5 minutes. I don't remember much about what happened next. The world around me became a blur, the edges of reality dissolving as the countdown ticked closer to 0. All I could think about was the message, the final command that echoed in my mind like a mantra: let go. And so I did. What would you have done? Have you ever felt the pull of something you couldn't explain but couldn't resist? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe for more unsettling tales.